There is a specific kind of person who, when someone asks them how they are doing, answers before the question is even finished. Not because they are eager, it's because they have already calculated what the other person needs to hear, adjusted for the relationship, filtered out anything that might burden or inconvenience, and delivered a response that closes the conversation before it opens too wide. They do this without thinking. That is not an exaggeration. The process happens below conscious awareness, faster than language, somewhere in the body before the mind has been consulted. If you ask them to slow it down and explain what just happened, most of them could not. They would tell you they were just being normal, They would tell you there was nothing to explain. That last part is important. There was nothing to explain. At some point, a decision was made, not in words, not in a single moment, but across many thousands of small moments. That explanation was a form of risk. That needing to be understood was a form of exposure. So that the gap between what you actually felt and what you were allowed to say was not a wound, but a condition of belonging. And so the explaining stopped. Not all at once. Gradually, the way a person stops trying a door that has never once opened. They stopped because the door stayed shut. They stopped because the cost of hoping it would open became greater than the cost of walking away. What remains in adulthood is someone who functions, who's often extraordinarily capable, who handles things, who seems, from the outside, to require very little, and who carries inside them a kind of weight that has no name because the language for it was never taught to them. Not because it did not exist, but because in the environments where they grew up, that language was not safe to speak. To understand why some people stop explaining themselves, you have to go back to the place where explanation first became dangerous, not dangerous in an obvious way. Not violent, necessarily. Not the kind of danger that makes the newspapers. The quieter kind, which is harder to name precisely because it is woven into what was called love. Think about what a young child actually needs in order to develop a coherent sense of self. They need a caregiver who can tolerate their emotional states without collapsing under them or retaliating against them. We need the experience, repeated thousands of times, of feeling something, expressing it, and being met. Not fixed, not silenced, met. What happens in that meeting is not just comfort. What happens is that the child's nervous system learns that the interior world is survivable, that feelings have edges and ends, that distress is not permanent, and that other people are a source of regulation rather than a source of threat. The child, over time, builds a felt sense that they exist, that they matter, and that there is enough relational safety to bring themselves into the room. When that meeting is inconsistent, when the caregiver is sometimes present and sometimes absent, sometimes warm and sometimes overwhelmed, sometimes attuned and sometimes threatened by the child's needs, something more complex happens. The child does not conclude that the caregiver is unreliable. Children cannot afford that conclusion. Instead, they begin to monitor. They develop, with extraordinary precision, the ability to read the room. They learn to track emotional temperature in others, a flicker of tension around someone's eyes, particular quality of silence, a shift in weight or tone, and they use that information to calibrate their own presentation. They learn to become acceptable, to become easy. This is not failure. This is intelligence operating under constraint. The nervous system, faced with a caregiving environment that could not consistently hold all of who the child was, adapted by narrowing what it brought forward. It learned that certain emotional expressions closed the distance and others created it. It learned that need was sometimes welcome and sometimes a burden, and that the difference between those two outcomes was not predictable, which meant the only safe strategy was restraint, always restraint. Not once, but 10,000 times, the lesson was reinforced. Make yourself smaller, and you will be safer. There are children who grow up inside this kind of environment, carrying responsibilities that far exceed what their development can actually hold. They become interpreters of adult emotion. They become the stabilizing presence in households but the adults are destabilized. They manage their own grief to protect a parent's composure. They suppress their own fear to prevent escalation. They learn to need almost nothing because needing things creates unpredictability, and unpredictability in their world was the thing that preceded harm. These children are often described admiringly as mature for their age. What is not said is what that maturity cost them, what was not available to them because their cognitive and emotional resources were already entirely occupied with managing the emotional climate of the adults around them. The body keeps running this process long after the original environment has changed. This is not a metaphor. The same neural systems that learn to scan for threat in childhood continue to scan for threat in adulthood, because they were never given a credible signal that the scanning could stop. A person may be in a relationship with someone who is genuinely safe, genuinely available, genuinely interested in their interior life, and still find themselves withholding, still find themselves editing before they speak, still find themselves bracing somewhere behind the sternum for the moment when the other person will become too much, or when they themselves will become too much, or when the whole thing will tilt into something they cannot manage. The bracing has no current justification. It doesn't need one. It predates justification. It predates language. It is in the body before the mind is asked. What often accompanies this is a specific, pervasive discomfort with being cared for. Not just difficulty receiving care, which is common, but something more fundamental, a felt sense that care is conditional, that it will eventually be withdrawn, that accepting it to fully creates a vulnerability that cannot be recovered from. Some people describe a tension they cannot explain when someone offers help, an impulse to refuse, to minimize, to reroute the attention back toward the other person. They do not experience this as avoidance. They experience it as courtesy, as not wanting to be a burden. What they do not recognize, because it happened before they had the conceptual framework to see it, is that being a burden was once genuinely dangerous. That needing too much in their original environment had consequences. And that somewhere in the nervous system, that equation has never been updated. Hyperindependence, in this light, is not a personality trait. It is a scar wearing the costume of a strength. It is the logical conclusion of an environment in which dependence was unsafe. The person who insists on handling everything alone, who cannot delegate, who feels a low-grade anxiety during rest because rest feels like exposure, who cannot name what they are afraid of, but whose body remains subtly activated even in the absence of threat, that person is not difficult. They are not broken. They are still doing what once kept them alive. The strategy has outlasted its usefulness. It is running in a context where it no longer applies, but the nervous system does not update its threat assessments based on logic. It updates them based on repeated, embodied experience of safety. And safety, for many of these people, has never been fully available to inhabit. There is a particular loneliness in this. Not the loneliness of isolation, necessarily, because many of these people are surrounded by others. It is the loneliness of being consistently present for people in ways that no one has ever been consistently present for them. Of being the person others turn to, the one who is trusted with weight, the one who does not crack, and of feeling. Underneath all of that, a quiet, wordless recognition that no one is coming. Not because the people around them are cruel, because they have very effectively trained the people around them not to come. They have managed their distress so thoroughly that others do not know it exists. They have been so reliably fine that their own need has become invisible, not just to the people around them, but often to themselves. The body carries the cost of this, not abstractly, in the specific, chronic, low-level activation of a system that was never allowed to fully discharge, in the fatigue that does not resolve after sleep, in the tension that lives in particular places, the jaw, the shoulders, The diaphragm, as if the body is still holding something it was never given permission to put down. Chronic stress, accumulated across years of emotional suppression and hypervigilance, has a weight that is not psychological. It is physiological. It reorganizes systems. It changes baselines, makes a state of alert feel like a state of normal, so that when real safety is offered, it does not register as relief. It registers as suspicious. Shame, in this context, is not the shame of doing something wrong. It is the shame of needing. It's the early, wordless, body-level conclusion that to have needs is to be a problem. That the self, as it actually exists beneath the performance of competence and containment, is too much or not enough, or both simultaneously. This is not a belief that can simply be argued out of. It was not argued in. It was installed through experience, in the years before language, in the space between a child and a caregiver, in the thousands of small moments where reaching was met with nothing. It lives below the narrative, below the insight. It can survive decades of intellectual understanding and remain entirely intact. And so the explaining stops, not as a decision, as an adaptation. It's the only reasonable response to an environment in which the interior world was not safe to bring forward. The person learns to translate themselves into whatever is most acceptable before they speak, learns to manage the emotional climate of rooms before they enter them, learns that the only reliable form of control in an unpredictable world is to need nothing, to show nothing, to give everything, and to make the whole arrangement look effortless. What no one tells them, what often cannot be told, because it has to be experienced in the body before it can be believed in the mind, is that the original danger has passed, that the scanning can stop. Not because the world is now safe in a guaranteed, absolute sense, but because rest is no longer a threat. Because needing something from another person is no longer evidence of catastrophic misjudgment. Because the self, the actual interior self that was made so carefully manageable for so many years, does not require permission to exist. That recognition does not arrive as relief. It arrives as a kind of grief for the years spent being so very competent at disappearing, for the child who learned so early that the cost of being known was too high to risk, for all the rooms that were read and managed and survived rather than simply entered. It is a quiet, heavy thing, not an ending, not a beginning. It's recognition that does not resolve into anything clean. It's just a slow, sober understanding that the door was never locked from the outside.